The Mahavamsa is an important document for us in our understanding of early Theravada Buddhism. It's not a canonical text. That means it's not a religious text. However, it's very important and it's very highly regarded in Sri Lanka because it provides the story of the national chronicle of the Sinhalese and their early ethnic history. Also, it's an important source of information for us about early Theravada Buddhism. So, for example, we're reading today information about one of the Buddhist councils. This text is one of our primary sources of information about those first 3 Buddhist councils in which the canon of the religion, the Tripitaka, was really finalized upon. So we've talked about that first council that happened immediately after the Buddha's death, but then there were subsequent councils, and as you read, there have been councils in the 20th century as well. So it's not a religious text per se, but it's still an important source of our religious knowledge, primarily the spread of Buddhism to Sri Lanka. And of course, the story that we're given is semi-mythical. And so as readers and as historians, what we have to do is try to separate the myth from the reality. And part of that is by looking at other pieces of information like epigraphy. Epigraphy means writing in stone. So we look at stone inscriptions that can be dated around the same time. So for example, we are fairly sure that the kings that are named in the Mahavamsa are actual kings. So we think that in large part it's reporting actual historical events, even though they've been mythologized to some extent. So it talks about the history of Buddhism in India, basically from the time of the Buddha's death to the third council. And of course, at each of these councils, they're looking at the text, they're trying to figure out what were actually the words of the Buddha, what are things that seem legitimate, are accepted, are well remembered, and trying to eliminate any possible errors in the way that they've recalled it. So these chronicles of Sri Lanka really probably began being maintained before the Common Era. So the Mahavamsa is actually most likely sort of a combination of earlier histories, earlier chronicles that have been put together. And this is probably part of the way that it gets its name. Maha means great, so you can think of like the Taj Mahal. So Maha means great, and Vamsa is just sort of the tale. So it's the great tale. Now we have an earlier document as well, the Dipavamsa. Dipa means island, and so basically that's the story of the island. And the Mahavamsa is probably an elaboration on it as well as other chronicles. Now there's also a second text called the Chulavamsa, which covers the later period, in fact, all the way up to the British. And again, this is a text that combines earlier texts and sort of grew over time. These texts were maintained by monks from the Mahaviharya in the city of Anuradhapura. And it was compiled under the rule of Mahanama of Anuradhapura, who was the presiding king. What I'd like us to do now is to look at that city from a contemporary perspective. So we'll watch a short clip of a video on this particular city. The images that you have been seeing are also all from the city of Anuradhapura.
One of the most famous historic capitals is the sacred Buddhist city of Anuradhapura. This city is estimated to be 2,500 to 3,000 years old. It was the nation's capital from the 4th century BC until the 11th century AD. There is a tree on the site that is supposedly a cutting from Buddha's Tree of Enlightenment. Some of the best preserved vestiges of old Lankan society are here. Anuradhapura is a city of great history, religious importance, and serene beauty.
History rises like the sun over the land of Lanka, dispelling the darkness of myth and legend on the full moon day in the month of Pusam, in the year 247 BC, when there appeared on a rock in the north-central region of the island Arahat Mahinda, bringing with him the gentle doctrine of Gautama the Buddha. Within a century, a great civilization was born and flourished in the fertile valley of the Malvatuoya, with its center in a city called Anuradhapura. Under the symbolic shade of the Sri Mahabodhi, a branch of the Bo tree in Buddha Gaya, where Buddha attained enlightenment and brought to Sri Lanka within a few years after the arrival of Arahat Mahinda by his own sister, Sanghamitha. A close link was forged between state and Buddhism. There developed a lifestyle perhaps unique in the ancient world. The forest-capped mountains rise from cultivated valleys whose green crops watered by artificial lakes that set at naught the periodical droughts to which the northern provinces are subject. This fertility was not merely for physical subsistence, but fed the spiritual life of the vast masses, sustained their dreams and maintained a faith reflected in the awesome religious monuments. Ruwanweli, or the Gold Dust Dagam, built in the 2nd century BC to mark the birth of a nation, when King Dutukamanu, hero of the epic Mahavamsa, born of the legendary Princess Vihara Mahadevi of the western region, sired by a king of the deep south, united the 3 regions under one scepter. It is one of the most beautiful monuments to a faith in the world. To the north of the sacred city of Anuradhapura stand Abhayagiri, one of the most important centers of Buddhist academia in the ancient world. It is recorded in chronicles that Abhayagiri was built by King Vattagamini Abhaya, popularly known as Walagamba, somewhere between 89 and 77 BC. Covering approximately 200 hectares, Abhayagiri Vihara had all the components required by doctrine for a Buddhist temple: the image house, stupa, bo tree, shrine or bodhigara, chapter house or poyage, resident monks, and refectories. However, this complex grew over 5 centuries and reached its zenith in the 7th century AD. The centerpiece of the monastery, Abhayagiri Stupa, as it stands today, is the original as last renovated by Parakrama Bahuda I, sometime in the 12th century AD. This is Jetavana, a stupa at the center of a monastic complex which stood in direct rivalry to the Abhayagiri. Built by King Mahasena, who ruled at Anuradhapura between 276 to 303 AD. The gigantic stupa, which is the focal point of the monastery complex, was the 3rd tallest monument in the world at the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD. It was surpassed only by the 2 tallest pyramids at Gizeh. At over 120 meters in height, it is the tallest stupa in the world and indeed the tallest brick building ever built by man. In the words of the British civil servant Sir Emerson Tennant, who gazed upon it in awe, the materials are sufficient to raise 8,000 houses, 30 streets half a mile in length, would construct a town the size of Ipswich or Coventry. They would line an ordinary railway tunnel 20 miles long, or form a wall 1 foot in thickness and 10 feet in height, reaching from London to Edinburgh. This deceptively simple monolithic Buddha statue in the Samadhi or contemplative pose is now considered a masterpiece of Buddhist art. Its classical simplicity and purity of line and form have invested it with a translucent spiritual quality, reflecting the Spartan code of Theravada Buddhism. It dates back to the 4th century AD and is referred to by the Chinese traveler Fa Hien. We may infer that the monastery complex at Jetavana housed nearly 3,000 monks at a time, going by the size of the refectory. The site, covering approximately 80 hectares and set out as a monastery, contains all the elements of a highly evolved monastic architecture. Scattered around the site are many residential complexes or colleges, integrated into a well-planned theological academy. The scale of the refectories or alms halls at both Abhayagiri and Jetavana are clear indications of the large number of residential students, scholars and other members of these monasteries, which may have been anything from 4,000 to 5,000 at any given time. This Pilimage or image house, 27 feet in height, had once upon a time contained an upright figure of the Buddha. Only the base remains today, with its chamber stripped of all the precious offerings, buried before erecting the statue.
So the Mahavamsa begins with a visit by the Buddha to the island of Sri Lanka. Now, we know that this never happened for a few different reasons. First of all, we have a pretty clear idea from the Nikayas, from the Sutta Pitaka, where the Buddha actually traveled during his life. And we know that he never made it to southern India at all, and certainly not Sri Lanka. The Chronicle has him flying there. At this time, the island is populated primarily by yakas or yakshas. So these are supernatural beings in the Indian tradition that have sort of a dual nature. Sometimes they're considered to be sort of benevolent nature spirits. You could think of them like wood nymphs, but then sometimes they're portrayed as more malevolent, as evil spirits, something like the rakshas, which are sort of the demon ogres of the Indian tradition. The Buddha flies there and terrifies them with miracles of thunder, rain, and lightning as he hovers overhead. And they cry out to him and ask him to dispel their fears. And so the Buddha, as the dispeller of fears, agrees to, and he teaches the Dharma to these supernatural beings. And the beings all convert to Buddhism, and furthermore, they dedicate the island to the Buddha. So there's this mythological understanding of the island of Sri Lanka as a Buddhist island that links back, at least in the imagination or the collective imagination of the Sinhalese, through the Mahavamsa. So the island itself is a land of Dharma. Now, this is going to have implications later when we move on through the different chapters of the Mahavamsa. There's an intervening chapter, and then we reach the chapter on the first Buddhist assembly. And this is very important because this provides us with information about what actually happened. So the council is presided over by Mahakassapa, the Grand Thera. Now, Thera, where we get the word Theravada, means elders. So Theravada literally translates to the saying of the elders. So Mahakassapa himself is in charge of working with the assembly of monks in order to assemble the Dharma. So Ananda, who we encounter often in the suttas, is given charge for all of the Dhamma except for the Vinaya. And another of the Buddha's disciples, Upali, is in charge of the Vinaya. And so then Mahakassapa questions Upali on the Vinaya. So remember, the Vinaya are the rules of conduct for monastics, monks and nuns. And so questions were asked, and then Upali answered them. So based upon these answers and based upon the recollection of Ananda and the other monks that were present, the Thera tradition, the Theravada tradition, is established. Now, this is also important because this links the Theravada tradition then directly to the Buddha. So Theravada is seen as directly related to the teachings of the Buddha, and this is one of the ways that Theravada argue against Mahayana schools of thought, like the Prajnaparamita schools of thought or Yogacara. They claim that they are closer to the Buddha's original teachings because they can trace their religious canon, the Tripitaka, back to the actual time of the Buddha. So it was assembled immediately after the Buddha's death. And so this is the story of the first of the Buddhist councils. What's also significant here, and we shouldn't lose sight of, is the idea that it is the tradition of Sri Lanka that has also preserved those oldest, purest teachings of the Theras. Now, the second council is then held after there have been some controversies, primarily that there were bhikkhus of the Vaji clan who were teaching things that were contrary to the teachings of the Buddha or contrary to the Vinaya. And so it was determined that there needed to be a new council because these heretical ideas or heretical beliefs had arisen. And so there is the next council is held there. The Dhamma is recited once again, and again they go through this process of reform and the elimination of errors. Now, this is also important because this forms correct lines of initiation. And later, when we look at the controversy involving women monastics, we'll see that these lines of initiation become quite important. So the idea is that only these schools that are found to be orthodox can actually initiate individuals into the monastic community. The next chapter is about the Third Council, and it is actually critically important because it provides us with much information not to be found anywhere else about the king Ashoka. So the king Ashoka was the grandson of Chandragupta, who created the first Indian empire, taking advantage of the power vacuum that was left after the invasion of Alexander the Great. Ashoka was, by all accounts, himself a great warrior and a great conqueror, but he encounters Buddhism, hears the Dharma, has a change of heart, and regrets the expansionist destruction that he has caused and the loss of lives, and becomes a very devout Buddhist. He begins supporting the monks. Buddhism essentially becomes the state religion of the Gupta Empire, with Ashoka at its head. And what's significant for our story is Ashoka holds the Third Council in order to ensure that the Dharma being preached in his kingdom and practiced by monks in his kingdom is in fact legitimate. And so the Dharma is reconfirmed, but also that Ashoka's two children convert to Buddhism and become monastics. So his son, who we encounter later, Mahinda, and his daughter, Samgamita, both become monastics. So Mahinda becomes a monk and Samgamita becomes a nun. So they request their father's permission to enter into the monastery. At first, he maybe feels some regret because this should be the king. The son was 20 years old and the daughter was 18, but he agrees to allow them. And so Mahinda is then taught after the Tara Mogali, and within 3 years, it's said that he sort of masters the Buddhist doctrine. Now, he will then travel. He will be sent by his father to Sri Lanka, and he will be responsible for bringing Buddhism to the human beings of Sri Lanka. Because remember, of course, the Buddha has already come and converted the spirits of Sri Lanka to Buddhism. And so Mahinda will then travel as an emissary and missionary to Sri Lanka and bring Buddhism to the island. The subsequent chapters describe the various consecrations of the kings. So these chapters are more or less historical, recounting the dynastic succession. If we skip forward, though, to chapter 13, we have the story of the coming of Mahinda, who you will recall was Ashoka's son. So the story is that Mahinda practiced as a monk for 12 years in India and then was sent forth as a missionary to Sri Lanka. So the coming of Mahinda is one of the celebrated aspects of the Mahavamsa, as it again discusses the reconsecration of the island to the Buddhist religion. Then the chapters describe some elements related to Buddhism, beginning with the founding of the Mahavihara of Arunadapura. So you should recognize Maha by now, so that means great, and Vihara or Viharaya is Pali for monastery. And so this then becomes the central monastery for this particular sect of Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka. So it's founded by the king Deva Nampiya Tesa, whose name means something like beloved by the gods, in Anuradhapura. And it was founded sometime between 247 and 207 before Common Era. And so this is the place where the Mahavihara orthodoxy was established by monks such as Buddhaghosa. So Buddhaghosa is a great commentator on the Theravada tradition. We should also not lose sight of the fact that the Mahavamsa as a chronicle was written and maintained by the monks of the Mahavihara sect. So we have, for example, the representation of other Buddhist sects in Lanka at the time, and they are depicted as heretical. Now, our depiction and knowledge of these other sects comes largely from the Mahavamsa itself. So it perhaps does not present them in the best light, and we have to be cautious about the knowledge that we have of these other Buddhist sects that we take from the Mahavamsa. Now, the other chapters include things like the dedication of another vihara in Chetya, the Chetya Pabata Vihara, the arrival of the Buddhist relics. So these are the leftover physical remains of the Buddha. The tooth relic is one of the most important places of pilgrimage, one of the most holy sites in Sri Lanka today, and the temple of the tooth relic is really world famous, and many temples across the world, for example in Myanmar and Thailand, have copies of the tooth that is contained at the tooth relic temple. The last part of the chronicle that I want to direct your attention to happens all the way in chapter 25, although the previous chapters lead up to it. And this is the victory of Dutta Agamani. So Dutta Agamani, or the fearless Gamani, ruled from 161 before Common Era to 137 before Common Era. And we're really quite clear of the dates. There's a lot of epigraphical evidence that supports this as well. Now, the chapter 25 is about his victory, and so we need to pay careful attention to this. He's known for defeating and overthrowing the kingdom of Ilara, which was ruled by a Tamil prince from the Chola kingdom. So the Chola kingdom was a Tamil empire that basically controlled the southern part of India, part of Sri Lanka, and some individuals actually think perhaps extended its rule all the way to Southeast Asia to the island of Sumatra. That's probably not correct, but what is clear is in 1057, the Cholas actually launched a naval force against the kingdom of Srivijaya in present-day Sumatra. What's important to keep in mind are that these Tamils are first ethnically different from the Sinhalese. The Sinhalese also speak an Indo-Aryan language. The Tamils speak a Dravidian language. And perhaps the most significant difference is the Tamils practice Astika religions. They were Hindu, while Dutta Agamani and his warriors were all Buddhists. So if we look at chapter 25 of the Mahavamsa, we learn that Dutta Agamani put a relic of the Buddha, we assume, into his spear and marched, quote, with chariots, troops, and beasts for riders. He went first to the monks, to the Sangha, and said, quote, I will go on to the land on the further side of the river to bring glory to the Dharma. Give us, that we may treat them with honor, bhikkhus, who shall go with us, since the sight of bhikkhus is blessing and protection for us. As a penance, the Sangha allowed him 500 monks. Taking the company of bhikkhus with him, the king marched forth. So he brings not only his warriors with their weapons and beasts of war chariots, but he also brings a relic of the Buddha and 500 monks with him as he goes into battle. He's very successful. He manages to slay his enemies. And when he had overpowered the 32 Damila kings, the Tamil kings, Dutta Agamani ruled over Lanka as the sole ruler. Now, later he feels remorse. He has slain all of the Tamils who have been resisting him. And then we get this mythical story that is very interesting for me with my focus on Buddhism and violence. So I'll actually read from the Mahavamsa here. Sitting then on the terrace of the royal palace, adorned, lighted with fragrant lamps, and filled with many a perfume, magnificent with nymphs in the guise of dancing girls, while he rested on his soft and fair couch, covered with costly draperies, he looked upon his glorious victory, great though it was, knew no joy, remembering that thereby was wrought the destruction of millions of beings. When the Arahats in Piyangudipu saw his thoughts, they sent 8 Arahants to comfort the king, and they, coming in the middle of the night, alighted at the palace gate. Making known that they had come thither through the air, they mounted to the terrace of the palace. The great king greeted them, and when he had invited them to be seated and had done them many reverence in many ways, he asked them their reason for coming. We were sent here by the Sangha to comfort thee, O Lord of men. And thereupon the king said again, How shall there be any comfort to me, O venerable sirs, since by me was caused the slaughter of a great host numbering millions? From this deed arises no hindrance in thy way to heaven, answers the Sangha. Only 1.5 human beings have here been slain by thee, O Lord of men. One had come into the 3 refuges. So if you'll remember, this is the Buddha, the Sangha, and the Dharma, the 3 jewels. And the other had taken on himself the 5 precepts. Unbelievers and men of evil were the rest, not more to be esteemed than beasts. But as for thee, thou wilt bring glory to the doctrine of the Buddha in manifold ways. Therefore cast away care from thy heart, O ruler of men. Thus exhorted by them, the great king took comfort. When he had bidden them farewell and given them leave to depart, he lay down again and thought, Without the brotherhood you shall never take a meal. Thus our mother and father have caused us to swear in our boyhood at a meal. Have I ever eaten anything whatsoever without giving to the brotherhood of the bhikkhus? Then he saw that he had, unthinkingly, eaten a pepper in a pod at the morning meal, leaving none for the brotherhood, and thought, For this I must do penance. Should a man think upon the host of human beings murdered for greed in countless myriads, and should he carefully keep in mind the evil arising from that, and should he also be very careful in keeping in mind the mortality as being the murder of all, he will then in this way win freedom from suffering and a happy condition. And here ends the 25th chapter, called The Victory of Duttamagami. This is significant in many ways. First of all, it offers a clear Buddhist justification for violence. Second of all, it states that since the king had killed unbelievers, people who were not Buddhists, he doesn't incur any demerit, that it's no worse than killing a beast. So these Tamils who are not Buddhists are dehumanized. Then they have the status of animals. One of the reasons why the Mahavamsa is so significant is because Sri Lanka fought a 20-year civil war between the Tamil minority and the Sinhalese. The Mahavamsa was often pointed to as a justification for Sinhalese dominance and rule over the entire island of Sri Lanka. Tamils, who again continued to be mostly Hindu, had sought autonomous zones, and failing that, fought for an independent state on the island of Sri Lanka. And it's in your lifetime that the Civil War ended with great loss of life. Buddhist monks were involved. They preached to soldiers. They were stationed with soldiers as chaplains. And the Mahavamsa was pointed to often, particularly by right-wing Sinhalese nationalists, as justification and past precedent for the way to deal with the non-Buddhist minorities of the island. So this text is not a dead text. As we've seen time and time again, these stories in literature, even though they're very old, often play a role in our contemporary world. So now there'll be a few questions that you'll need to answer. Note some of them are long answer. Your responses are going to be recorded, and this assignment will be for a grade. So please make sure that you answer the questions and you answer them fully. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this.